New York. So, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I need to speak up. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here with Steve. It's a real honor to share the stage with him and be here to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Institute. It's really wonderful to be with you. I don't actually think Steve Orlins needs an introduction to this audience, but anyway, I'm going to do a short one for you. Steve is a friend and, in my case, a mentor, and to many of you, and of course, has been closely watching U.S. China relations for 50 years, and his storied career. To those of us who also aspire to spend our lives looking and participating in the development of this relationship. Steve, out of law school, a small college in Cambridge, Massachusetts, joined the U.S. government, and actually as a young lawyer worked on the normalization between the U.S. and China. Then, of course, was a successful lawyer in the private sector and even more successful investment banker in New York and in Asia. And this coming May will celebrate his 20th anniversary as the president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations.
Amy, you're making me feel very old.
Well, what I mean to do is impress upon all of us who know it, but just good to hear again, just the breadth and depth of your experience looking and participating in the development of this incredible bilateral relationship, Steve, so that we can just dive right in and talk about your perspective on many of the questions that were put to all of us for this agenda today of prospectively, what are we looking to in the U.S.-China relationship under President Trump 2.0. But before we get to the perspective part, I know that you were just in Hong Kong and China. We were together briefly in Beijing. You spent 3 weeks on the ground there, Steve. And before we start to talk about Trump 2.0, I'd love to hear your perspective on the mood in Hong Kong, in Beijing, in Shanghai, talking about grading the Biden administration and how it has been able to manage the U.S.-China relationship over the past 4 years.
Well, wonderful to be here. Wonderful to celebrate ICAS's 10th anniversary. It's hard to believe it's already been 10 years. I feel like it was yesterday. You were asking me, how do we set this up in Washington? And it's great to see now Chairman Wu here, who's a great partner of ours in our maritime Track 2 dialogue, which is so important in establishing a communications channel between the United States and China on these issues. I think in terms of being in Hong Kong and China, people are already looking past Biden. I think they're already trying to, people in China and the government, think tanks, businesses are already trying to figure out what President-elect Trump is going to do. I think that if I were to summarize the views, it would be hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I think there's a lot of concern about the upcoming tariffs. There's a lot of concern. There's not much knowledge about what President-elect Trump is going to do on the strategic side, what's going to happen with respect to Taiwan, what's going to happen with respect to the South China Seas. That's all not known, so they're all kind of, I think their view is buckle your seatbelts because they don't know what is going to happen. I think what was interesting, so during this time, we kind of saw the potential positive future and the negative future, which people have been talking about this morning. The positive future was the Biden administration, through careful diplomacy, arranged for the release of 4 Americans who ended up spending Thanksgiving with their families. And that was done through the channels of diplomacy that the Biden administration has focused on since the Wang Yi Sullivan meetings in Vienna now more than 2 years ago, that was a turning point in U.S. China relations, that the first period for the Biden administration for China was very rough, and then we had the Pelosi visit, we had all sorts of stuff which was really caused a significant rift in U.S. China relations. And then Sullivan and Wang Yi met. They laid out a plan of high-level visits of Chinese officials to the United States, American officials to China. Blinken went, Raimondo went, Yellen went, and then we had mill-to-mill conversations, and we suddenly had these channels which had been closed reopened. And that was a real positive. And the release of those Americans, the lowering of the travel advisory from 3 to 2, increasing cooperation on fentanyl was kind of, when you have channels of communication, you can still find places to cooperate. And that was kind of the positive. And that's a view that maybe, we'll talk about that, maybe President-elect Trump will, and his team, will seek to follow that path. The other was what Paul Triolo, I guess Paul's not here, was talking about, which is these new chip restrictions and chip equipment making restrictions, which were put on to China, and then the response of that. Paul, I just mentioned your name, but you weren't there. But then the response to that, it was the tit for tat, which I think in the previous panels, people were saying, gosh, it would be good not to do that don't react to these kinds of restrictions, but they did, and the Chinese government did, and the problem with that is it reminds Americans. So I was with the Congress yesterday, members of Congress, and what they said is, this just is an example of why we can't rely on China as part of our supply chain. That it was just, so instead of this having the effect of telling the Americans, don't do this, it told the American government, do it more, cut off supply chain more. And that's kind of the negative future. So you have this prisoner exchange, a positive development, and the tit for tat, the rare earth materials, and the chips being restricted. And that kind of, it shows what the future may be. What I said in my meetings in Hong Kong and in Beijing with think tanks, with government, with businesses, you have agency in this. You don't have to sit and wait. You, the Chinese government, there are lots and lots of things, and we've heard suggestions this morning of things the Chinese government can do. There are lots of things that the Chinese government can do to improve the atmosphere of U.S. China relations and allow for progress on certain issues. So that's kind of, I give the Biden folks a lot of credit for having arranged that. I give them credit for reestablishing the mill-to-mill channel. I give them credit for working with the Ministry of Public Security to restrict the export of precursors to fentanyl. And you know why that's so important? Because when I talk to audiences around the United States, I say, U.S.-China cooperation is saving the lives of your children. Tell it to the parents of a kid who didn't die of a fentanyl overdose, that U.S.-China cooperation is negative.
Well, I think that's a really good way to now turn to prospectively. How do you think the Trump administration and the team of rivals, as you referred to it, group of advisors, including cabinet members, are going to treat the U.S.-China relationship? I'd love your perspective, Steve, on President Trump's invitation to President Xi to participate in his inauguration on January 20th?
Early this morning, I asked the minister counselor that question. How will the Chinese respond? President-elect Trump has put together exactly what I call a team of rivals, that the perspective of his appointments are quite different from his and from each other. So we can't know. They will have these kind of discussions about what they should do, and the truth is we don't know how they're going to come out. We know a few things. One, obviously, we know the tariffs is going to be a major weapon. We are not clear. So when we talk to the incoming administration about tariffs and about jobs in the United States, what is clear from the first administration of President Trump? The tariffs did not bring jobs back to the United States. It diverted manufacturing to other countries, to Vietnam, Sri Lanka, all these other places, Malaysia, but they didn't come back here. So wouldn't it be interesting if Chinese companies, as we were talking about, were allowed to manufacture in the United States, were allowed to transfer their technology to the United States to do that manufacturing? When I think about it, I got my start, as Amy said, representing the first U.S. companies that invested in China. So in 1979, I moved to Beijing and I represented the first. And when U.S. companies wanted to invest, they had to transfer the technology. And they had to have a partial ownership. The Chinese contributed land and labor, and we contributed technology and IP. And then we shared the profits. Well, here we are 45 years later. Well, maybe we should be doing that, because the fact of the matter is, if those manufacturing jobs are in the United States and Americans are doing that, isn't that good for America? And isn't it consistent with President-elect Trump's concept of what should be done? Paul was talking about CATL, EV batteries. Is there really a national security interest in preventing EV batteries from being manufactured in the United States with Chinese technology? I don't think so. I dare people to make the argument that that is compelling. Solar panels, battery storage, there's a list of things that China can bring to the United States, and it would be beneficiary. It would be beneficial to the United States and to, I think, President-elect Trump's agenda. President-elect Trump talks a lot about infrastructure. I will have to leave. If I were in China, I could stay here till 4 o'clock. But because I'm in the United States, I have to get on a train that will take 3.5 hours to go to New York. When I grew up in New York, that's the same period of time it took me to come to Washington in the 1950s. It's incredible, but wouldn't Chinese investment in these areas benefit the lives of Americans? And wouldn't the construction that was part of that infrastructure investment create jobs for Americans? So there are all these interesting opportunities, but it's going to be up to his team to decide this. What was clear in this morning's conference, and I think what who was saying it in the last panel, that we've seen a securitization of everything. What we need is to know what is whitelisted, what is gray-listed, and what is blacklisted. We need, to put it simply, a definition of national security. And that will allow for manufacturing to come to the United States. It will allow us to export more to China than we do if we can have a clear definition, if we can have clear end-use certifications to know that they're not being used by the military. So there's so many interesting things that President-elect Trump's team can do that for reasons, that the small yard and the high fence didn't allow the U.S. and China to do during the Biden administration.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up. So please do think of a question you'd like to ask Steve in the last few moments of this panel. The National Committee's annual meeting, used as its theme this past year, balancing national security and economic prosperity. And I think that's precisely what you're talking about, Steve, that we have to, in these non-official channels, talk about the benefits for China, the benefits for the United States, of ways that we can enhance cooperation. And of course, it's challenged by the overall tenor of the bilateral relationship. One issue, I want to talk about one of those areas that is going to potentially continue to be a challenge that wasn't referenced this morning, you mentioned to me, and that is Russia, and the role that Russia will play in U.S. China relations after January 20th.
Yes, this morning we didn't discuss Russia much, and we probably should. There was some discussion of, the Russia-China relations has been the single greatest difficulty for the Biden administration, that you ask the Biden administration to list the problems, and they will say it's China's supply of materials to Russia that allowed Russia to reconstitute its industrial base and wage a more fierce war in Ukraine. So that's what the Biden administration would say. So now, and this is very hard to kind of get your arms around, President-elect Trump says he's going to end this war. So let's assume that he ends this war, and sanctions on Russia after the war is over are that Congress doesn't block him from ending sanctions on Russia. So U.S.-Russia relations become better. I think there's little question that if the Russians' aggression in Ukraine ends, it's going to have that effect. So what does that mean for Russia-China relations, and what does it mean for U.S.-China relations as a result? And I would welcome anybody in this room to tell me what is going to happen, because it is very, very, very unclear. Of course, the one thing I'm looking forward to is if the war ends and there's peace, flying over Russia to get to China, which would knock 4 hours off of my New York to Beijing flights in the winter. But it's certainly going to rearrange the geopolitical map. And I don't know where it ends up. I mean, clearly, President-elect Trump has strong relations with both Xi Jinping and Putin. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. It allows him to talk with the leaders of these countries and basically make deals. So I thought the invitation that President-elect Trump gave to President Xi to come to the inauguration was brilliant. I think it was brilliant. I'm constantly looking for ways to change the narrative on U.S.-China relations, to change the trajectory of U.S.-China relations. And here, President-elect Trump comes up with a way of saying to President Xi, we're close enough that I'm going to deviate from decades and decades of U.S. policy of not inviting presidents, leaders of other countries to the inauguration. He says, but you're friendly enough with me. It's so important that we talk that I'm going to invite you. And the incredible part, I don't think he will come. I think it's just too hard. But if he did, just think about it. It would create a requirement that on China policy, there be a transition between Biden and Trump. Because obviously, as the Chinese are fond of saying, there's only one president at a time. So the visit, the protocol of the visit would have to be arranged by the Biden administration. But then he would be here in Washington, D.C. as the government changed. I think that's hard for a Chinese leader. But does that mean that China shouldn't send a senior level delegation? I think they actually should, because what we've heard this morning is we're looking for channels of communication. And wouldn't that be a good channel of communication to be here as we move from one president to the next? And they would also see, I think, the beauty of American transitions, that we peacefully go from one government to the next. And this will be a more peaceful transition than the last one. So we're confident that this will happen. So I think it was a brilliant tactical move, and probably reflects some of the difference between President-elect Trump and those around him. But we don't know if this was cleared through the transition team, if the new appointees all approved.
Well, it certainly gives the transition team a reason to be speaking with Chinese counterparts, which, as you mentioned, the Chinese government has been looking for those inroads, and so I think it's very positive. I have one more question for Steve, but I promised I would open it up, and so I am ready. Hello, Chairman Wu.
Thank you,
Please.
Amy, for wonderful questions you put forward to Steve, President Steve Orlins. I still remember your remarks that it was in 2018 you cited Chairman Mao's quotation. It is very famous Chinese. 同志，在困难的时候，我们要看到成绩，要看到光明，要有勇气。Comrades, during the difficult time, we should notice the achievement we made. We should notice the brighter future we will have, and also we should have courage ourselves. So that's the basic meaning. So my question to you is very simply, are you still optimistic about the future China-U.S. relations when President Trump is in office? My concern is about the people-to-people exchange. Do you think there may be more hurdles to our people-to-people exchange, particularly our track to dialogue? Do we think it will, survive? Thank you.
I think our track to dialogue will survive because we decide that it will survive, that we decide that it performs an important role in keeping channels of communication between the U.S. and China opened. I don't think the channels will close. But if they do, then the role of these many track two dialogues, of the people-to-people dialogue that Amy and I participated in Beijing, become more important. I often think about the quote, 在同志们在困难的时候要看到成绩，看到光明，提高我们的勇气。And it really summarizes my view of U.S. China relations in many ways. 看到成绩, look at our record. we've mentioned today, we've had peace in Asia since 1979. No American soldiers have died since we established diplomatic relations. In the decades and decades before that, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers died on the battlefields of Asia. And we forget that. So often we forget that we've had peace. Kandao Guangming, I got to be an optimist. I've worked on China now I moved to China 45 years ago, and I've witnessed changes that I never would have believed I could witness. I mean, there's Dennis, others in this room have Michael, have seen these things. I mean, it's been amazing. So I have to be an optimist. And 提高我们的勇气. We have to be brave. If we're not in the political majority, it's okay. It's okay. Look around at the people who are with you. And you kind of go, if I'm going to fight a war, this is who I want to fight. I want to be in the trenches with me. And then I think back, I was not in the political majority when I started to study Chinese. I was an opponent of America's war in Vietnam, and I was in a tiny political minority. And then that minority grew and grew and grew. And ultimately, we became the majority view. So I don't, 提高我们的勇气, we need to be brave. But the other is, I don't get up in the morning and worry that I'm wrong. I pretty much know we're right. We're right. Communication and education are right. In what world should we not continue to defend that? And the view is, there is no world. We need to stand up for what we believe, even if it requires 提高我们的勇气.
We have 2 minutes, and so one last question. We're going to get Steve out of here in 3 minutes. So, final question.
This is Mimi Fan from the Heartland China Association. Steve, so wonderful to hear your inspirational remarks. I was just from another event about sister cities. Coming from the Heartland, we see a lot of local government taking actions that's not very hawkish, while the federal is not as. So do you see that, given the election, surprise almost half the country with the kind of sentiment around fear or whatnot? So how do we navigate when the federal and the local government are taking different stance on exchanges? Thank you.
Subnational governments need to work more with China. What we will see is California working more closely with China on climate change. We see cities in the heartland sending their mayors to China. Smart cities is a great way that the United States and China can cooperate. Do we all want less pollution? Do we all want less traffic? Do we all want better infrastructure? We do, and cities and states can share knowledge on that and improve the lives of their citizens. So I think what we need to be doing is demonstrating that constructive and productive U.S. China relations are in the interests of the people. And I mean the American people. So when we talk about make America great again for the people. And constructive relations benefit from the people and benefit the people. And when you talk about it, you always talk about the benefits it provides to the American people and the Chinese people.
I hope that you will join me in thanking Steve for being so constructive and also thoughtful about how we should play a role in improving this relationship. Thank you, Steve.
Well, once again, thank you, Mr. Steve Orlins and Ms. Amy Celico for putting together such a great conversation. So we'll proceed immediately to the next panel, and when our hotel friends going to set up the stage again. So the third panel, it's a new dimension to our annual conference. So this year we're going to bring in different voices from the third parties who's looking at the U.S. China relations. So stay tuned, we'll be being rightly.